if you enjoy having your heart ripped out of your chest by literature, then I'm recommending a bunch of world literature to you that will rip your heart out of your chest. Hi, and welcome to another video. Today is the first weekday of daylight savings, so it's the first day that I've looked out my window at the end of my workday at 5 p.m. and saw pitch black. It's not as bad when you work from home, but it's still pretty bad. And yeah, living in the dark kind of sucks. And I was just thinking, you know, when I first started working from home at the beginning of the pandemic, that's when I started to read a lot. I went from reading 20 odd books a year to 60 books in 2020, 104 books in 2021, and currently at 120 and counting for 2022. So I wanted to tell you about some of the books that I read during the early pandemic that really got my reading going even more, and that just inspired me to now be someone who reads over 100 books in a year. Okay, I have 10 recommendations for you, and yeah, I just hope you like them. The first book I have for you is Stephen King's The Stand. So this is a little brick. My edition has, how many pages? Like 1,400 pages. And it smells really good. And I'm so happy I picked up this book. It was a perfect early pandemic book, and I know that sounds obscene, given that this book is about a pandemic that wipes out 99.9% of humanity. But it's ultimately a book about survival, and it's a book about people, and that's what I care about the most, is human relationships. When a man escapes from a biological testing facility, he sets in motion a deadly domino effect, spreading a mutated strain of the flu that will wipe out 99% of humanity within a few weeks. The survivors who remain are scared, bewildered, and in need of a leader. To emerge, Mother Abigail, the benevolent 108-year-old woman who urges them to build a community in Boulder, Colorado, and Randall Flagg, the nefarious dark man who delights in chaos and violence. The reason I recommend this book is because it has so many sort of phases. Like, it doesn't get old, it doesn't get boring, which I thought was really neat. Like, the early panic phase is cool, and then there's the phases where you're following a bunch of characters who are just navigating being alone. Everyone they know has suddenly died, and this includes like kids navigating being by themselves, and a lot of them don't make it for like stupid reasons, like a child breaks their leg and then dies of hunger kind of thing, or dies of an infection because they don't know how to get antibiotics. It's definitely a dark book, but I think it's a very impressive book. It's very monumental. I know in my last video I was kind of breaking up with Stephen King a little bit, and I'm definitely putting him down for a while, but this book, I will recommend it widely, and if it was King at his worst, I'd say The Stand is probably King at his best. The next books that I remember reading, I remember this so vividly, reading these books in May of 2020 on my balcony. After I read the first one, I had to pick up the second one, and I was so sad that there wasn't more. It's Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents. It's so beautiful. Let me tell you what these books are about. When global climate change and economic crises lead to social chaos in the early 2020s, hey, that's us! California becomes full of dangers, from pervasive water shortages to masses of vagabonds who will do anything to live to see another day. 15-year-old Lauren Alamina lives inside a gated community with her preacher father, family, and neighbors. Precocious and clear-eyed, Lauren must make her voice heard in order to protect her loved ones from the imminent disaster her small community stubbornly ignores. The reason I love this book, and the reason it really spoke to me, is that it felt very near, and it felt very hopeful. So this is a book about a climate apocalypse, and about a teenage girl who believes that we can do better. And a girl has a vision of a way a community can function. Her community is taken from her early in the book. Her gated community is overrun by people outside who have literally gone feral because of an economic crisis, along with a political crisis, along with a climate crisis. it really reads like it could happen here, even though it was written, gosh, it was written a while back. I forget if in the 90s or the early 2000s. Let's find out. This was first written in 1993. I was born in 94, so this was written before I was born, but it feels modern. It feels like it was written this year, last year. I recommend this book so much, and I love Octavia Butler. I love the way she writes. I love her characterization. It's gorgeous. And then I would argue the sequel is even better. In the sequel, our main character, Lauren, has established a community in this world, this really nice, like, kind of hippie farm commune, but like in a good way. And the world tries to take that from her. In 2032, Lauren Olamina has survived the destruction of her home and family and created a peaceful community in Northern California based on her newly founded faith, Earthseed. The fledgling group provides refuge for outcasts facing persecution after the election of an ultra-conservative president who vows to make America great again. Yeah. In an increasingly divided and dangerous nation, Lauren's subversive colony, a minority religious faction led by a Black woman, becomes a target for President Jarrett's reign of terror and oppression. Copyright 1998. So I'm just saying, Octavia Butler knows things that we don't know. This is a 2-for-1 recommendation situation. I recommend them as a joint thing. The third recommendation I don't have a prop of, but it's Exhalation by Ted Chiang. It's a collection of short stories, and they're short sci-fi stories. And there was something so beautiful and so comforting about these. So Ted Chiang is the author who wrote the short story that the movie Arrival was based off of. And in general, he writes these really like lyrical and heartfelt science fiction stories. And just this collection, when I read it, I was exactly what I needed. There was this really cool story about how creationism, like an alternate reality where creationism is backed up by science, and what scientific evidence of creationism would look like. And I thought it was a really interesting thought experiment. And I think he wrote it in a really cool and respectful way. And just in general, he took themes of, well, took devices such as time travel and talking animals and parallel galaxies and space travel and all these kinds of things to tell really interesting, very humane stories. I really recommend this if you're looking for a short story collection and want to dip your toes into sci-fi. Now we're changing gears completely because I want to talk to you about the book that I think was the best book I read in 2020, and that is saying a lot because these books are great, but this is Pachinko. And you might have heard about this. It was recently adapted as a television show. I haven't seen it yet. And it's also gained a lot of popularity. And this book is so beautiful. Like, I just remember the emotions of reading it. What struck me the most was this book had representations of love in a politically challenging and a socially challenging situation. And it's an intergenerational saga, meaning we see how, great-grandma's life influenced grandma's life, influenced father's life, influenced grandson's life, that kind of thing. And it's so incredible to experience the history of a country through the history of a family. This is about a story of a Korean family that's displaced to Japan through a indecent, out-of-wedlock pregnancy, and what happens to this family. And Koreans in Japan during that time were treated very much as unwelcome immigrants and very much as outsiders, and experienced just a lot of discrimination. And there was a lot of political turmoil around it, and which is explored gorgeously in this book. I feel like I learned a lot. And then the title Pachinko refers to a gambling game. If you're not familiar with what a Pachinko parlor is, it's a gambling game of chance. So this title really emphasizes how much the course of our lives depends on chance. I don't know, this book is absolutely beautiful. I really recommend it if you're at all interested in Korean and Japanese history, and if, like me, you love family sagas. This was so good. I want to reread it. I want to annotate it. I love it. The next 2 books on my list I don't own, but I do want to do them justice, so I'm gonna look them up on Goodreads. Alright, the next book I'm gonna tell you about is 1,000 Splendid Suns, which is essentially the spiritual sequel to The Kite Runner, which I think is more famous than 1,000 Splendid Suns, but 1,000 Splendid Suns is so... it's so moving. I found it more moving than The Kite Runner, and I found The Kite Runner very moving. Mariam is only 15 when she is sent to Kabul to marry the troubled and bitter Rashid, who is 30 years her senior. Nearly 2 decades later, in a climate of growing unrest, tragedy strikes 15-year-old Layla, who must leave her home and join Mariam's unhappy household. Layla and Mariam are to find consolation in each other, their friendship to grow as deep as the bond between sisters, as strong as the ties between mother and daughter. With the passing of time, the Taliban come to rule over Afghanistan, the streets of Kabul loud with the sound of gunfire and bombs. Life a desperate struggle against starvation, brutality, and fear. The women's endurance tested beyond their worst imaginings. Yet love can move people to act in unexpected ways, lead them to overcome the most daunting obstacles with a startling heroism. In the end, it is love that triumphs over death and destruction. 1,000 Splendid Suns is a portrait of a wounded country and a story of family and friendship, of an unforgiving time, an unlikely bond, and an indestructible love. Okay, so this book is really sad and contains, in general, these books are really sad and contain a lot of very difficult themes and very sad scenes, but I still really recommend them. Like, if you enjoy having your heart ripped out of your chest by literature, then I'm recommending a bunch of world literature to you that will rip your heart out of your chest. So let's go for another, and that's Homegoing by Yaa Gyasi. It's really funny. On Goodreads, it says, readers also enjoyed Pachinko. And I'm like, yes, spiritually they're together. So this is also historical fiction, and it's set in Ghana and the United States. It was so good. My review, it's quite short. All it says is wow, wow, wow. And the reason I say that is because this book covers 2 family branches, half-sisters and then their descendants, for 8 generations, and the book is short. Yeah, it's 300 pages. It is a very short book to cover 8 generations from 2 different branches, and yet it paints these scenes in, like, the vignettes that we get from each person's life are so moving, and it just, like, how do I even put it? It's like a crashing wave in your face of how much things echo through generation, how much trauma can echo through generations, how much history can influence descendants in ways that they might not realize and that aren't always clear. This is why I love family sagas. I think they're an amazing genre. And Homegoing is a masterpiece, and it's so good to read. I wrote it's an amazing feat of a novel, and I absolutely still agree with that. It is a feat, it is an achievement, and I loved it. I absolutely loved it. Even though I still want to travel the world in terms of the books I'm recommending to you, I'm now recommending to you a book from Poland, which is actually my home country. I was born in Canada, but I was very much raised by Polish immigrants, and I speak Polish, and I want to reread this book in Polish. I absolutely loved it. So this is Drive Your Plow Over the Bones of the Dead by Olga Tokarczuk. And this is, how do I even describe it? In a remote Polish village, Janina devotes the dark winter days to studying astrology, translating the poetry of William Blake, and taking care of the summer homes of wealthy Warsaw residents. Her reputation as a crank and a recluse is only amplified by her not-so-secret preference for the company of animals over humans. Then a neighbor, Bigfoot, turns up dead. Soon other bodies are discovered in increasingly strange circumstances. As suspicions mount, Janina inserts herself into the investigation, certain that she knows who done it. If only anyone would pay her mind. So what I really appreciated about this book is that the main character was an older woman who isn't someone who usually gets to be a main character, and she was a very eccentric older woman. So living in a cabin by herself, friendly with animals, really into astrology. There's a lot of astrology in this book. It's quite entertaining. I think she's a vegetarian and just sort of like living her best cozy core cottage life. But then people start dying in her little village, so she decides to kind of Miss Marple it a little. But things remain sort of like occult and weird and creepy. And all the things that make it weird also make it rewarding, excellent, and deceptive. What a great read. I absolutely love it. I really recommend it. And I hope you enjoy. And if you have read it, I'd love to talk to you about it and to hear your thoughts, because I have been alone in my love for this guy. And it's just, talk to me about it if you've read it, because it's so... Ugh. So now we're moving from where I come from, Poland, to where I live now, North America. Look at me trying to do a transition. Though this book is actually set around Oakland, just not where I live, but close enough. And the next book I want to tell you about is There by Tommy Orange. This is a book that follows 12 different characters in sort of their own short vignettes, and their lives kind of come together, which, as I've mentioned multiple times on this channel, is one of my favorite ways of telling a story, is having this tapestry of people. So these 12 characters are all from Native communities, all traveling to the big Oakland powwow, all connected to one another in ways they may not yet realize. Among them is Jackie Redfeather, newly sober and trying to make it back to the family she left behind. Dean Oxendine, oh, my cat wants to eat. Dean Oxendine, pulling his life together after his uncle's death and working at the powwow to honor his memory. 14-year-old Orville, coming to perform traditional dance for the very first time. Together, this chorus of voices tells the plight of the urban Native American, grappling with a complex and painful history, with an inheritance of beauty and spirituality, with communion and sacrifice and heroism. Hailed as an instant classic, There is at once poignant and unflinching, utterly contemporary, and truly unforgettable. What I wrote in my review was that this book is really clever, and it knows it's clever, but it doesn't rub the cleverness in your face. It's a really awesome and informative read. Some of the scenes have stayed like etched in my mind, even though I read it over 2 years ago now. I just think this was an absolutely brilliant book, especially if you're interested in reading some Indigenous voices and learning a little more about the history of Indigenous people in North America and the consequences of that history in modern day. I have 2 more books. So this one's set pretty close to where I grew up. This is an Alice Munro book called Who Do You Think You Are? And the title alone drew me to this book because it's such an accusatory tone. It's such a, who do you think you are? Why do you think you could do this? Why do you think that you're good enough to do this? You're just this tiny speck of dust. You're just this, you know, this silly person. And I was going through a lot at the time, and I think that the title just really, really jumped out at me. And then this is also a collection of short stories, but they follow the same characters. So really it's a novel where the chapters skip over time. Rose and her stepmother Flo live in Hanratty, across the bridge from the good part of town. Rose, alternately fascinated and appalled by the rude energy of the people around her, grows up nursing her hope of outgrowing her humble beginnings and plotting an escape to university. Rose makes her escape and thinks herself free. But Hanratty's question, who do you think you are, rings in Rose's ears during her days in Vancouver, mocks her attempts to make her marriage successful, and haunts her new career back east as an actress and interviewer. So the main character is from a small town in southern Ontario. I think it's like pretty close to London, Ontario, and really struggles with finding her way in the world. But what I love the most about Alice Munro is she writes in this confessional but simple tone that just, again, plucks at your heartstrings. I think that's the common theme with a lot of the books that I'm recommending, is they're like heartstring tuggers. And I don't know how to sell you on this book beyond, like, if you felt not good enough, especially because of where you came from, if you feel like you haven't been able to shake that, this is a gorgeous book, and this might be the book for you. So those are actually all the fiction recommendations. I have one more book recommendation, and it is a nonfiction book. And it's the very famous Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. So this is a book about how trauma affects our bodies and our brains and what we can do about it. This is a very, very difficult book. It's a very challenging read, and while all the fiction books I talked about deal with difficult topics, I would argue that this one probably warrants the largest content warning because it tells so many true stories of people who've been through terrible things and try to cope with it. That said, the book is kind of divided into a few sections. So the first section is a neurobiology section, which for me was very basic because it was all kind of things that I studied and things I was interested in already. But I've heard from other people who aren't scientists that it was interesting, somewhat advanced, but still accessible. There's a lot of really cool diagrams, and I think it's written in a really engaging manner and in like bite-sized chunks to help explain how stress, but especially trauma, affect different parts of the brain, why things like the language centers shut down, how trauma memories are stored, why is that different from other memories, how people with a history of severe trauma process emotions differently and process like emotional cues differently. It's excellent. And then the author goes on to describe a lot about therapy approaches and stories of people in his practice, because the author is both a researcher and a practicing psychotherapist. So I'll read you the back real quick. Trauma is a fact of life. Veterans and their families deal with the painful aftermath of combat. 1 in 5 Americans has been molested. 1 in 4 grew up with alcoholics. 1 in 3 couples have engaged in physical violence. Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, one of the world's foremost experts on trauma, has spent over 3 decades working with survivors. In The Body Keeps the Score, he uses recent scientific advances to show how trauma literally reshapes both the body and the brain, compromising sufferers' capacities for pleasure, engagement, self-control, and trust. He explores innovative treatments, from neurofeedback to meditation to sports, drama, and yoga, that offer new paths to recovery by activating the brain's natural neuroplasticity. Based on Dr. van der Kolk's own research and that of leading specialists, The Body Keeps the Score exposes the tremendous power of our relationships both to hurt and to heal, and offers new hope for reclaiming lives. I can't recommend this highly enough, but I have to say it's a very challenging book, and I know a lot of people don't end up not finishing it, so I would even recommend just pick chapters that you think would speak to you the most and go for those, because it's a very well organized book, and I think even just a few pages, it already adds a lot of richness. And yeah, this book made me feel very seen in 2020. So those were 10 book recommendations. I hope you enjoyed them. These are the 10 books that I found most memorable of my 2020 pandemic reads. 2020 pandemic, confinement, quarantine reads, whatever you want to call them. Thanks so much for watching the video, and thanks for caring about my recommendations. I wish you well, and I hope you're taking good care of yourself, and I hope you're reading a fantastic book. I don't know what else to say, because I already wished you well, and I already wished you a good book. Okay, well, I'm just gonna wish you a great rest of your day, because you deserve it.